The car simply disappears, not slowly, not with warning. One moment it is parked in a quiet residential driveway in Pinellas County, Florida. The next moment the asphalt opens beneath it and the car drops 10 feet into a void that has no business existing in a neighborhood that looks perfectly ordinary. No cracking beforehand, no tremor, no visible sign on the surface that anything is wrong. Just the ordinary geometry of suburban America, and then a hole. Florida logs more than 1,000 sinkholes per year. That number is not an estimate based on models or satellite inference. It comes directly from the Florida Geological Survey's incident database, which has been cataloging reported sinkhole events for decades. Some are the size of a bathtub, some are the size of a city block. In 2013, a man in Hillsborough County fell into one that opened directly beneath his bedroom while he was sleeping and was never recovered. The floor simply swallowed him. The house was demolished. The hole was filled. The neighbors moved. Florida is the most visible version of a problem that exists across much of the United States. But the problem does not stop at Florida's borders. It runs from the karst plains of Texas to the sediment valleys of California. It lives under New Orleans, under Houston, under the Sacramento Delta, under the neighborhoods of Phoenix and Las Vegas, under hundreds of miles of water main, gas pipeline, highway, and rail infrastructure that was designed for ground that stays still. The ground is not staying still. In recent years, scientists at NASA's Jet Propulsion Laboratory and at the USGS have assembled something that should have changed the national conversation about infrastructure and development: a map. Actually, several maps. Built from satellite radar data capable of detecting ground movement at the scale of millimeters, they show the American landscape not as a fixed surface, but as a dynamic one. A breathing, sinking, shifting skin stretched over geology that is changing faster than most of the structures built on top of it were engineered to tolerate. This is the story of what those maps show, what is causing the ground to move, where the worst zones are and what is happening inside them, what the history says about where this leads when no one intervenes, and what the science can measure with precision and still cannot predict with certainty. If this kind of deep, real science holds your attention, take a second to like and subscribe. It genuinely helps. The maps are already drawing the lines. Let's begin. The tool that revealed the scale of this problem did not come from a borehole or a water table sensor. It came from orbit, and it works by listening to its own echo. Interferometric synthetic aperture radar, InSAR, is a technique that uses radar pulses transmitted from satellites to measure the precise distance between the satellite and the ground below. A pulse goes down. The ground reflects it back. The satellite records the return time to nanosecond accuracy. Then, days or weeks later, the satellite passes over the same spot again and fires another pulse. If the ground has moved even by a few millimeters, the return time changes. By comparing the two radar returns and mapping the interference pattern between them, scientists can produce an image that shows exactly which parts of the surface have risen or fallen, by how much, and when. Think of it as a ruler so precise it can detect the distance between a dime and a piece of paper laid on top of it from 400 miles above the Earth's surface, through clouds, through darkness, through seasons. The measurement does not require access. It does not require drilling. It does not require anyone on the ground to know it is happening. The satellite simply watches, and the ground tells the truth. The USGS and NASA JPL have used InSAR data to build subsidence maps across the American West, the Gulf Coast, and parts of the Southeast. What those maps reveal is a landscape that is, in dozens of locations and for multiple overlapping reasons, going down. Not everywhere at the same rate, not for the same reason in every city, but consistently, measurably, documentably, the ground is lower in 2026 than it was in 1990 in ways that the infrastructure resting on it was never designed to accommodate. The maps do not care about politics or real estate values or zoning approvals. They record what the ground is doing, and what the ground is doing in more American cities than most people have been told is sinking. The mechanisms driving this descent are not all the same. They do not all look the same on the surface. They do not all fail the same way. But they share a common thread. The ground is losing the material or the pressure or the structural support that was holding it up, and once that support is gone, it does not come back. The worst single area in the United States, the one where the rate of descent most strains comprehension, is not a sinkhole region. It is a valley. The San Joaquin Valley of California runs roughly 250 miles down the interior of the state, flanked by the Sierra Nevada to the east and the Coast Ranges to the west. It is one of the most productive agricultural regions on Earth. It grows cotton, tomatoes, pistachios, grapes, garlic, dairy cattle, and an enormous fraction of the country's stone fruit. And it is sinking, not slowly, not abstractly. In the most heavily pumped areas near the towns of Corcoran and El Nido, the land dropped more than 28 feet over the 20th century. At the peak of groundwater pumping during the 2012 to 2016 California drought, some areas were sinking at rates approaching 2 inches per month. 2 inches per month. That is not a geological timescale. That is a speed you can watch. To understand why the ground drops when water is removed, you have to understand what an aquifer actually is. Most people picture an underground lake, a cavern filled with liquid that you pump out like emptying a bathtub. That is not what an aquifer is. An aquifer is a layer of porous rock or sediment, sand, gravel, silt, in which water fills the tiny spaces between the solid particles. The particles themselves are what hold the ground up. The water fills the spaces between them. It also exerts upward pressure on those particles, which partially supports the weight of the land above. When you pump water from an aquifer, two things happen. The pore spaces empty, and the particle matrix, which was being partially supported by the hydraulic pressure of the water, is now bearing the full weight of everything above it alone. Under that increased load, the fine-grained sediments, the silts and clays in particular, compress. The spaces between particles collapse. The grains press together, and the land surface above drops by the exact thickness of the layer that has compacted. The compression is largely permanent. That is the critical fact. Unlike a spring that stretches and returns to its original length, fine-grained sediment that has compacted under load does not re-expand when the water is restored. The pore space is gone. The structure has failed. Recharging the aquifer may stabilize future subsidence, but it cannot uncompress what has already compressed. The 28 feet of land that the San Joaquin Valley has lost will not come back. It is gone permanently, independent of how much it rains, independent of how carefully the aquifer is managed going forward. The California Aqueduct, 444 miles of concrete canal that moves water from Northern California to the southern part of the state, runs directly through the San Joaquin Valley. It was built in the 1960s to precise engineering specifications. Grade, slope, and flow rate were calibrated to a surface that engineers assumed would stay roughly where it was. It has not. Sections of the aqueduct now sit in terrain that has dropped multiple feet below its original elevation. The concrete has cracked. The flow capacity has been reduced. Bridges that cross the canal have had their clearance altered by the sinking of the banks on either side. The infrastructure is out of tolerance because the land it was built on is no longer where it was when the blueprints were drawn. A USGS report published during the peak of the 2012 to 2016 drought described the rate of subsidence in parts of the Tulare Lake bed, the historical lake bed at the southern end of the valley that was drained for agriculture a century ago, as extraordinary by any historical standard. The word extraordinary appears in USGS technical language when the data is producing results that the authors find genuinely difficult to contextualize within prior experience. The valley floor in some locations was dropping faster than any previously recorded subsidence rate for a major agricultural region in the United States. But the San Joaquin is one kind of problem. Florida is something else entirely, something older, something that operates on a completely different set of physics, and something that the maps show in alarming concentration across a state that added more than 300,000 new residents in 2023 alone. To understand why Florida is dissolving from below, you have to understand what it is made of, not what it looks like on the surface, sandy, flat, subtropical, but what is actually there beneath the thin organic soil and the lawn grass and the parking lots. Florida is limestone, almost entirely limestone, stacked thousands of feet deep, formed from the compressed skeletons of marine organisms that lived in a shallow sea covering this part of North America for hundreds of millions of years. Limestone is a sedimentary rock, and it has a property that makes it unique among the materials that continents are built from. It dissolves, not in water alone, in slightly acidic water. Rainwater, as it falls through the atmosphere, absorbs carbon dioxide. The result is carbonic acid, weak, barely perceptible in a glass, but chemically active over geological time. When this mildly acidic rainwater percolates down through Florida's sandy surface and enters the limestone below, it begins dissolving the rock. Not quickly, not visibly. Grain by grain, crystal by crystal, across thousands of years. But the dissolution is real, and it is ongoing, and the result is a landscape riddled with underground voids, caves, tunnels, and chambers of empty space where solid rock used to be. Geologists call this terrain karst. The word comes from a limestone plateau in Slovenia, where the phenomenon was first formally studied. It applies to about 40% of the contiguous United States in some form. Tennessee, Kentucky, Missouri, Arkansas, and large portions of Texas and the mid-Atlantic states all have significant karst geology. But Florida's version is among the most developed on the continent. The holes down there are not small. Some of the cavern systems beneath north-central Florida extend for miles. Some chambers are large enough to dive in. Florida Springs, the famous crystal-clear blue springs that draw divers and tourists to parks like Ichetucknee and Ginny, are the surface expression of those underground voids, places where groundwater under pressure finds a route to the surface and wells upward into the open air. The spring is beautiful because the void beneath it is large. The void is large because the dissolution has been running for a very long time. A sinkhole forms when the roof of one of those underground voids collapses. Picture a thick book held open by its covers, with the pages slowly removed one by one from the middle. The covers still look intact. The outside still looks like a book. But the structural core that was holding the shape is gone, and at some point, not predictable, not warning you, the covers fold inward and collapse. That is what happens when a limestone cavern ceiling fails. The overlying sediment and surface material, which has been bridging the void like a skin stretched over an empty space, suddenly has nothing to support it from below. In a dry limestone system, the collapse can be gradual. The void grows until the roof thins enough to give way over months or years. In a system where water is involved, the failure can be near instantaneous. Water saturates the sediment above the void, adds weight to a weakened ceiling, and triggers collapse in a matter of minutes or seconds. The rate of this process is not constant. Rainfall intensity matters enormously, and increasingly, human water use is the dominant variable. Florida's cities, farms, and golf courses pump enormous volumes of groundwater. The Floridan aquifer system, which underlies essentially the entire state and extends into parts of Georgia and the Carolinas, is one of the most productive aquifer systems in the world. It is also the system whose pressure partially supports the overlying sediment column. During drought periods, pumping accelerates. When groundwater levels drop, the hydraulic pressure that the water was exerting on the walls and ceiling of underground caverns diminishes. The void loses its internal buttressing. The overlying sediment, no longer buoyed by water pressure from below, presses heavier onto a weakened ceiling, and the ceiling fails. Drought does not create karst. It cannot dissolve rock at any relevant speed. But drought, combined with heavy groundwater pumping, systematically removes the last thing holding a pre-existing void system from collapsing. Here's the part that most news coverage of sinkholes consistently misses. The ground does not fail at the moment the void forms. It fails at the moment the void grows large enough that the ceiling can no longer span it. That gap between formation and failure can be years. It can be decades. The void grows silently, invisibly, without any surface expression, while the house above it is bought and sold, while the road above it carries daily traffic, while the water main above it delivers pressure to a neighborhood that has no idea what is forming beneath the pavement. The surface looks stable because the surface has not failed yet. It is the structure below the surface that determines when failure arrives, and that structure is invisible to any instrument that does not go underground or use specialized ground-penetrating radar. The history of sinkholes in the United States is long enough to establish a clear pattern. And the pattern, when you read it carefully, is not the pattern of random geological events. It is the pattern of known risk, deferred response, and consequence arriving on a schedule that the science was capable of projecting decades in advance. In May of 1981, a sinkhole opens in Winter Park, Florida. It begins as a small depression in the backyard of a residential property. Within hours, it is 350 feet wide and 75 feet deep. A car dealership disappears into it, a swimming pool, a 3-bedroom house, 2 Porsches, and a camper. The city is watching, and there is nothing to do but watch. The event becomes the most photographed sinkhole in American history, the image that puts karst terrain on the map for a generation of geologists and a generation of homeowners who had no idea what was underneath them. Winter Park is the most dramatic single collapse on record, but it is not the most dangerous pattern. The most dangerous pattern is not the sudden hole. It is the slow, invisible one. In the years following 2000, insurance companies operating in Florida begin to notice a trend in their claims data that precedes any visible sinkhole collapse. Foundation cracks appearing in concentrated geographic clusters. Doors and windows no longer closing properly in homes built within the past decade on solid-seeming ground. Cracking along interior walls in specific neighborhoods, not correlated with weather events, not correlated with construction age or quality. Engineers investigating these properties begin finding the same thing beneath them: voids. Small at first, but growing with each season of water table fluctuation and groundwater pumping. dozens of homes in Pasco County, Hernando County, and Hillsborough County are condemned not because the ground has visibly and dramatically collapsed, but because the ground beneath them has been measured by ground-penetrating radar, by specialized drilling, by electrical resistivity surveys, and found to be hollow in ways that make structural failure a matter of when, not whether. The Corvette Museum's sinkhole in Bowling Green, Kentucky, in February of 2014, pulls a different thread. Kentucky is not Florida. It does not have the same subtropical rainfall, but it sits on similar limestone geology, the same carbonate rock, the same dissolution process, the same potential for void formation. The sinkhole that opens beneath the National Corvette Museum's Sky Dome exhibit measures 60 feet wide and 30 feet deep and swallows 8 irreplaceable cars in under a minute. The museum had been built over a known void system. The surveys had shown it. Mitigation had been planned but not completed. The void grew faster than the timeline for remediation. This is a pattern that repeats across karst America. The geology is mapped. The risk is known. The intervention is scheduled. And the ground does not wait for the schedule. Across the Gulf Coast and into the interior, a different dissolution process is at work, one that operates in a different medium at a different depth, with consequences that are less dramatic per individual event and more dangerous per decade of accumulated effect. Salt. The Gulf Coast of Louisiana, Mississippi, and Texas sits over enormous deposits of evaporate rock, layers of halite, gypsum, and hydrite, and other mineral salts that were laid down when ancient shallow seas evaporated over millions of years and left their dissolved mineral load behind as solid rock. Salt is even more soluble than limestone. It dissolves faster in fresher water without requiring the slight acidity that limestone needs. Where groundwater contacts salt deposits, and it does, through natural flow paths in the sediment and through injection wells and solution mining operations associated with oil and gas production, the rock simply disappears into the water that moves through it. The void left behind can be enormous and can form over years rather than millennia. The industrial history of the Gulf Coast is full of salt caverns that were deliberately created, pumped full of fresh water to dissolve the salt, then used as storage vessels for natural gas, petroleum products, and other materials. The Strategic Petroleum Reserve, the U.S. government's emergency oil stockpile, is stored in a series of such caverns beneath coastal Louisiana and Texas. The engineering of these caverns is sophisticated and well monitored. The caverns that were not created deliberately, the ones that formed from natural dissolution or from older industrial operations that were less carefully managed, are the problem. In 2012, the Bayou Corn community in Assumption Parish, Louisiana, wakes to a sound described by residents as a long, low rumbling in the pre-dawn hours. Then the swamp adjacent to the neighborhood begins draining. Visibly quickly, the water level in the bayou drops as if someone has opened a drain in the bottom of it. In the days that follow, a sinkhole nearly the size of 6 football fields opens where the swamp was, exposing a crater that keeps expanding. Gas begins bubbling up from the bottom, not in small quantities, but in volumes that can be lit on fire at the surface. The investigation that follows reveals that a salt cavern used for industrial solution mining by a petroleum company had destabilized and collapsed. The collapse created a hydraulic pathway through which natural gas and crude oil from a deep formation could migrate upward through the sediment column to the surface. The entire Bayou Corn community of approximately 350 residents is placed under mandatory evacuation orders. The evacuation runs for months. Some residents never return. The sinkhole continues expanding slowly for years after the event. the Bayou Corn event receives national coverage for several weeks. Then it disappears from the news cycle. The sinkhole is still there. The gas migration continues. The community that existed in that location does not. That is the rhythm of subsidence and dissolution events in America. Dramatic for a news cycle, invisible in the interval that follows. The public moves on. The geology does not. The sinkhole does not fill itself. The aquifer does not recharge. The salt does not resolidify. The landscape that existed before the event does not return. And the next community in a similar geological situation, watching from a distance, may not fully absorb the lesson before the same mechanism finds its way to the surface beneath them. Now pull back to the maps. The satellite radar systems that NASA and USGS have been operating give scientists the ability to see this problem at a scale that no ground-based survey can match. InSAR data over the American Southwest shows the San Joaquin Valley sinking in real time, the surface dropping in patterns that follow the footprint of the most heavily pumped agricultural irrigation districts. In some zones, the InSAR color maps are vivid, an entire county's worth of land coated in the warm colors that indicate descent. Surrounded by stable beige terrain, the image looks like a bruise on the landscape, spreading outward from the centers of heaviest pumping. The same data over the Texas Gulf Coast shows Houston and Galveston sitting in a bowl of their own making, land that has subsided as much as 12 to 15 feet in some industrial waterfront areas over the past century. The city itself, which sits less than 50 feet above sea level at its highest and less than 10 feet in many of its neighborhoods, has been actively lowering itself for decades through groundwater and petroleum extraction from the sediment layers beneath it. Galveston Island, already a narrow barrier strip that was devastated by the hurricane of 1900, which killed more than 6,000 people in the deadliest natural disaster in American history, has been sinking toward the Gulf of Mexico throughout the century since. The seawall built after 1900 to protect the island was constructed to address the storm surge of that era. That era's ground elevation. The island is lower now. The water it must hold back is higher. The Harris-Galveston Subsidence District was created in 1975 specifically because the subsidence had become visible and damaging. It is one of the few regulatory bodies in the country whose entire purpose is to stop the ground from sinking. The district imposed regulations on groundwater pumping within its jurisdiction, requiring large users to transition to surface water from alternative sources. The data shows that in regulated zones where groundwater was replaced, the rate of subsidence slowed significantly. In areas outside the district's jurisdiction, it did not. The geology responds to what the surface does. Stop removing the water and the compression rate decreases. The compaction cannot be reversed, but it can be stopped. Houston's experience is the clearest demonstration in the United States that subsidence is manageable, not through technology, but through the decision to stop doing the thing that causes it. The InSAR maps over the Sacramento-San Joaquin Delta carry a number that takes a moment to process. The peat islands of the Delta, the low-lying agricultural islands near Sacramento where organic soil has been farmed for 150 years, now sit an average of 15 to 20 feet below sea level, in some areas closer to 25. The process that caused this is not groundwater pumping. It is oxidation. When wetland peat, the compressed, partially decomposed organic matter that forms in marshes and bogs, is drained for agriculture, it is exposed to oxygen. Exposed peat oxidizes, meaning it chemically combines with oxygen and converts to carbon dioxide gas, which escapes into the atmosphere. The solid organic material that was holding up the land surface literally becomes a gas and disappears. The land does not just compact, it vanishes into the air. It is among the most counterintuitive environmental processes in the country, farming, not extraction, dissolving a landscape into the sky. The islands of the delta that now sit 20 feet below sea level were once at sea level. They went down not over millions of years. They went down over 150 years of farming. The levees that surround them, originally built to reclaim wetland for agriculture, now serve as the only barrier between the islands and catastrophic flooding from the surrounding delta channels. If those levees fail, as they have repeatedly in flood years, the islands flood and the water that enters them cannot drain. The elevation is gone. The land would have to be abandoned or permanently pumped. Those islands sit directly in the water supply plumbing for 25 million Californians. The pumps that move water from the delta southward operate in the same geographic zone as these sinking levee-ringed islands. Levee failure in the delta is not an agricultural problem. It is a statewide water emergency dressed in agricultural clothing. New Orleans requires its own reckoning. The city sits on the Mississippi River Delta, which is itself among the most geologically dynamic and subsidence-prone landforms on Earth. The sediment that built the delta is young, geologically young, meaning it arrived in the past few thousand years. As the river deposited its load at the edge of the continent, young sediment is loose sediment. It compacts under its own weight. It compacts further when drained. It compacts further still when structures are built on top of it. New Orleans has been compacting since its founding in 1718, and the rate of compaction has accelerated with every decade of development, drainage, and groundwater withdrawal. Parts of New Orleans now sit more than 10 feet below sea level. The average elevation of the city's residential neighborhoods is several feet below sea level. The pump system that drains rainfall and groundwater from the city bowl runs constantly, not seasonally, not during storms, but every hour of every day of every year. Without those pumps, the city would fill like a bathtub from below. The system has more than 120 pumping stations and can move enormous volumes of water per minute. It is, in engineering terms, impressive. In risk terms, it is the only thing standing between 400,000 people and an inundated bowl surrounded by the Mississippi River on one side and Lake Pontchartrain on the other. Hurricane Katrina made the vulnerability of that system visible to the world in 2005. What received less attention in the aftermath is that the failure was not just an event, it was an accelerant. The flooding that followed the levee failures introduced additional water into the sediment beneath the city. When that water drained, the sediment compacted further. Post-Katrina InSAR measurements documented accelerated subsidence in neighborhoods that had been deeply flooded. The disaster made the underlying problem worse, adding additional inches of permanent descent to areas that were already among the lowest in the city. Katrina did not just flood New Orleans. It pushed parts of it closer to the water table that was always trying to reclaim it. What does all of this mean for the 50 million Americans who live in zones where the satellite maps show active, measurable ground subsidence? The answer depends on which type of subsidence is under their feet and how fast it is moving. But across all the mechanisms, karst collapse, groundwater-induced compaction, organic soil oxidation, salt dissolution, a consistent set of infrastructure consequences emerges from the data. And the data has been accumulating long enough to establish a clear hierarchy of failure. Pipelines fail first. The natural gas and water distribution networks that serve American cities were engineered for a ground that remains at a consistent elevation and orientation. These systems are not rigid monolithic pipes. They are assembled from segments, each connected to the next, by joints designed to accommodate small thermal expansions and contractions, but not large differential vertical movements. When the ground drops unevenly, a foot in one block, 2 feet in the next, the pipe joints that span those segments are put under bending stress they were not designed for. The joint cracks. If it is a gas main, gas escapes into soil before any surface sensor detects it. It accumulates in the subsurface. It finds its way into basements, utility corridors, and the spaces under concrete slabs. The conditions for a gas explosion exist before anyone knows there is a gas leak. In Houston, the subsidence bowl created by decades of groundwater extraction produced differential movement severe enough to crack gas mains and water lines across entire neighborhoods, requiring hundreds of millions of dollars in emergency repair and replacement that no city budget line item had anticipated. Roads and bridges follow. Differential subsidence, the kind where one side of a bridge abutment or road section drops faster than the other, creates step changes in pavement and structural alignment that begin as minor roughness and end as safety-critical failures. Bridge approach slabs, the concrete sections that transition from the stable bridge deck to the roadway surface, are particularly vulnerable. When the embankment beneath the approach settles and the bridge itself does not, or vice versa, the slab develops a bump that grows with each cycle of wetting and drying, loading and unloading, until it becomes a hazard. The I-10 corridor through coastal Louisiana runs through some of the most actively subsiding terrain in the country. Highway maintenance costs in this corridor are dramatically higher than for equivalent highway sections on stable ground, because the surface keeps moving underneath the pavement regardless of how recently the road was repaved. Foundations are the third failure mode, and the one most directly affecting individual homeowners. Slab foundations, the concrete pad on which most southern and southwestern American homes are built, are designed to act as a rigid platform that distributes the building's weight evenly across a stable surface. They are not flexible. When the surface below them subsides unevenly, the front corner dropping faster than the back, or one side settling into a void that the other side has not yet reached, the slab cannot flex to follow it. It cracks. The building above it reflects those cracks in its walls, its floors, its door frames, and its window openings. These symptoms are real structural damage to load-bearing elements, arriving not because of poor construction, but because the ground itself has changed shape. For a homeowner, the experience begins as an annoyance and becomes a crisis without a single clear transition moment. A door that sticks in August. A hairline crack in the hallway wall by October. A gap between the floor tile and the baseboard by spring. The house does not fall, it drifts. It changes slowly and continuously, and the homeowner adjusts, fixes small things, postpones large decisions, until the day a structural engineer estimates the foundation repair cost and the number no longer fits in the annual budget. In active subsidence zones, this moment is coming for a statistically predictable fraction of the housing stock. The timing is the only unknown. The insurance market understood this before the regulatory market did. Florida has addressed part of the karst problem through its sinkhole insurance framework, which requires insurers operating in the state to offer sinkhole coverage as an endorsable product. After a series of catastrophic sinkhole-related insurance losses in the early 2000s, however, many insurers in the highest risk counties began repricing that coverage beyond what most homeowners could afford, or pulling it from the market entirely. Homeowners in Pasco and Hernando counties, two of the highest sinkhole density counties in the country, found themselves in a market where the insurance product that covered their primary geological risk had become either unavailable or prohibitively expensive. The financial system made its actuarial judgment about the ground before the planning system had restricted development on it. Properties kept being built, insurance kept getting harder to find. 2. The gap between the two is where individual families discover that they are financially exposed to a geological risk they did not know existed when they signed the purchase agreement. The communities along the Louisiana coast face a version of this that goes beyond insurance. When land loss is measured in football fields per day, the concept of property insurance, which assumes the property will exist in a recognizable form after the policy year, begins to lose its meaning. Some communities in coastal Louisiana have been formally relocated, their residents bought out by federal and state hazard mitigation programs and resettled on higher ground. Ile de Jean Charles, a Native American community that had been inhabited for generations, was partially relocated over the past decade as the island shrank around it. The relocation was not a crisis response to a single disaster. It was the managed acknowledgement that the land underneath a community had permanently and irreversibly diminished. It is the American landscape arriving at a condition the scientific maps had projected decades in advance. The question every city, county, and state in a mapped subsidence zone is ultimately facing is the same one. At what point does the cost of maintaining infrastructure on sinking ground exceed the cost of either relocating that infrastructure or accepting that it will periodically fail? There is no universal answer. The calculation depends on the rate of subsidence, the value of the infrastructure, the availability of alternatives, and the political will to make an economically painful decision in advance of a crisis rather than after one. Houston made that decision about groundwater regulation, not perfectly and not without resistance, but the Harris-Galveston Subsidence District's data show that where regulation was implemented, the descent slowed. The decision saved money that would otherwise have been spent on emergency repairs and disaster response. Managed intervention worked. Louisiana sits at the intersection of two subsidence mechanisms simultaneously, and the result is among the most clearly documented cases of landscape loss anywhere in the world. The Mississippi River Delta, which built itself over thousands of years as the river carried sediment from across the continent and deposited it in the Gulf of Mexico, is disappearing. Louisiana loses land equivalent to a football field roughly every 100 minutes. That number has been cited so often, it has lost some of its shock value. It should not have. It means that the coastline that existed in 1930 is gone, that the parishes where communities have lived for generations now sit in open water, that the buffer zone between the Gulf of Mexico and New Orleans, the marshes and barrier islands that historically absorbed storm surge before it reached the city, has been thinned to a fraction of its former extent. Two forces drive this simultaneously. The first is the interruption of sediment supply. The Mississippi River, constrained by levees built to prevent flooding and maintain navigation channels, no longer deposits sediment across the delta plain as it did naturally. The sediment that once rebuilt the coast is now channeled in a narrow corridor directly to the deep Gulf. No new sediment, no new land. The existing land, built from river-deposited material, is naturally compacting under its own weight. Fine-grained sediment compresses as the water is squeezed out of it over time, and without the constant recharge of new material from the river, the land goes down and is not replaced. This is natural subsidence at the delta's geological baseline. The second force is extraction. Oil and gas production from beneath the Louisiana coastal plain, one of the most productive petroleum basins in the country, has removed material from the deep subsurface, contributing to additional compaction of the overlying sediment column. Combined with groundwater withdrawal from shallower aquifers, the delta plain is sinking at rates that, in some locations, exceed a centimeter per year. New Orleans itself sits in a bowl that averages several feet below sea level. Parts of the city are below minus 10 feet. The pumps that keep the city dry run continuously, 24 hours a day, every day. Without them, the city would be a lake within weeks. The science that monitors this has become extraordinarily precise. InSAR data from the Copernicus Sentinel-1 satellite mission, operated by the European Space Agency, provides subsidence maps updated on a 12-day repeat cycle. NASA's UAV-SAR program, using airborne radar platforms that can fly at lower altitudes than satellites and produce even finer spatial resolution, has been mapping critical subsidence zones in California and Louisiana in detail that shows individual building footprints moving independently. USGS benchmark surveys maintained at fixed measurement points across the most active subsidence areas for decades provide the ground truth reference against which the satellite data is calibrated. The picture that emerges from combining these systems is not an estimate or a projection, it is a measurement. The ground is where the instruments say it is, not where the original surveys put it. But the precision of the measurement has not translated into precision of the response. The science can tell you the ground is moving. It can tell you where it is moving fastest. It can tell you which neighborhoods in a sinking city have subsided the most since 1990. It can identify the specific irrigation districts driving the fastest compaction in the San Joaquin Valley. It can map, in near real time, the Louisiana coastal parishes losing the most land and the fastest. What it cannot do is tell you the day the pipe gives way, or the hour the sinkhole ceiling reaches its critical threshold, or the storm that will be the one that finally overtops the levee whose crest is now measurably lower than its designed elevation because the embankment beneath it has compacted. These are non-linear events. The ground sinks incrementally. The failures arrive discontinuously. A pipe that has been bending slowly under differential settlement for 20 years does not give a warning before the joint finally cracks. A sinkhole ceiling that has been thinning for a decade does not announce the moment it crosses from thick enough to not thick enough. These threshold crossings are invisible to the instruments right up until they are not, and after they happen, the instruments confirm immediately, precisely, and usefully that the ground moved, which is documentation, not prevention. What the United States has not yet fully done is translate its extraordinary monitoring capability into land use policy and infrastructure investment that matches the speed of the ground movement below. The maps exist, the measurements are public, the risk zones are drawn with millimeter-scale fidelity. But zoning decisions in Florida's highest sinkhole counties still routinely permit residential development in areas where the Florida Geological Survey's own databases document dense sinkhole history, because the alternative, restricting development in a market under intense population growth pressure, is politically and economically difficult. Infrastructure replacement in Houston's subsidence bowl is chronically underfunded relative to the documented rate of damage because the damage is slow and diffuse enough to resemble ordinary aging rather than the specific and predictable consequence of geological movement that engineering records confirm it to be. The Sacramento Delta levee system, which protects both the agricultural landscape of the Delta Islands and the water supply infrastructure for a quarter of California's population, is maintained on budgets that independent assessments have consistently found to be insufficient relative to their documented vulnerability. The gap between what the instruments show and what the institutions do with that information is the real story behind the maps. The science is not failing here. The measurement is not failing. The translation from satellite image to zoning code, from InSAR map to building permit restriction, from ground truth survey to infrastructure replacement schedule is where the gap opens. Globally, American land subsidence is not exceptional in its scale, but the American example is the most studied, the most mapped, and the most clearly documented case of what happens when a developed, resource-rich country builds rapidly on geology it did not fully understand. Jakarta, Indonesia, is sinking faster than any major American city. Parts of the metropolitan area are dropping more than 25 centimeters per year, driven by unregulated groundwater extraction from a densely populated coastal plain with no adequate alternative water supply infrastructure. The Indonesian government has not just acknowledged the problem, it has begun planning the relocation of the entire national capital to a new site on the island of Borneo. A decision driven in part by the recognition that Jakarta cannot be made stable faster than it is sinking. That is a consequential decision for a nation of 270 million people, and it is being driven at its core by the same groundwater extraction dynamics that are sinking the San Joaquin Valley and the Houston waterfront. Tehran sits on a subsiding plain where satellite data shows differential subsidence across the metropolitan area that has cracked major infrastructure, including rail lines, roads, and building foundations. The groundwater beneath Iran's capital city has been drawn down dramatically as the country's water resources, stressed by a combination of climate change and population growth, have been unable to keep up with urban demand. The subsidence rate in parts of Tehran has been measured at several centimeters per year for over a decade. The city continues to grow into terrain that is visibly and measurably descending. Mexico City provides perhaps the most extreme urban subsidence example in the Western Hemisphere. Built on the dried bed of Lake Texcoco, where the ancient Aztec capital of Tenochtitlan was constructed as an island city connected to the shore by causeways, Mexico City has been sinking since the lake was drained by Spanish colonizers in the 17th century. The soft lacustrine sediment, the silty lake bottom material, has been compacting under the weight of the city built on top of it and further collapsing as groundwater has been extracted from layers below. In some parts of the city center, the historic colonial architecture that was built level has subsided differentially, with some structures sinking faster than others, producing the distinctive tilted buildings that are now a visual feature of the downtown. The total subsidence since colonial times exceeds 30 feet in some areas. The city continues to sink at rates of 20 to 30 centimeters per year in the most active zones, a speed that makes the San Joaquin Valley's worst years look modest. What separates the American situation from Jakarta, Tehran, and Mexico City is not the geological process. It is the institutional capacity to respond. The United States has the monitoring infrastructure, the engineering knowledge, the legal frameworks, and the financial resources to address this problem in ways that most of the world's sinking cities do not. Houston's subsidence district proved that institutional response works. Where groundwater regulation was implemented and enforced, the rate of descent slowed measurably. That is a demonstrated outcome at city scale over decades in the real world. It is not a model or a projection, it happened. The question every American subsidence zone faces is whether it will apply that lesson before the infrastructure fails or after. The ground is sinking where the ground is being undermined by water extraction, by dissolution, by drainage, by the removal of the geological material that was holding it up. The physics of that process are not mysterious, they are not contested, they are not new. The first large-scale subsidence warnings from the San Joaquin Valley appeared in USGS technical reports in the 1950s. The Florida sinkhole database has been growing since the 1980s. Houston's subsidence history was documented by the time the Subsidence District was created in 1975. The science arrived decades ago. The maps have been available for years. The question the American landscape is currently answering, city by city and county by county, is whether the institutions watching those maps can respond at the speed the maps are demanding. The maps are already drawing the lines. In Florida, the lines run through residential neighborhoods in Pasco, Hernando, and Hillsborough counties, where the sinkhole database shows concentrated history and the insurance market has already made its actuarial judgment, pulling out before the planning codes have restricted anything. In California's Central Valley, the lines follow the footprint of the most heavily pumped irrigation districts, drawn in feet of permanent, irreversible descent accumulated over generations of agriculture. In Louisiana, the lines are being drawn by the Gulf of Mexico itself, which advances into spaces that were dry land within living memory, over ground that is sinking faster than the sea is rising, a double compression from below and above simultaneously, with no natural reversal mechanism in sight. In Houston, the lines are the regulatory boundaries that the Harris-Galveston Subsidence District drew into its enforcement maps 50 years ago, and has been watching the city slowly work its way back inside, inch by measurable inch, as the pumping restrictions take effect. The USGS publishes its subsidence data openly. The InSAR-derived maps are publicly available through NASA's data portals. The sinkhole databases maintained by Florida and other karst states are accessible to anyone with an internet connection. This is not hidden science, not proprietary data, not information that requires security clearance or specialized access to find. It is public knowledge in the fullest sense, paid for by public funding, produced by public institutions, available to any person making a land purchase, a zoning decision, an infrastructure investment, or a political calculation in a country whose ground is actively, measurably, documentably doing something different from what the maps in most planning offices still assume. The ground is not where it was. In some places, it is a few inches lower than it was when the highway above it was paved, and the pavement cracked along lines the engineer did not plan for. In some places, it is 20 feet lower than it was when the first farms arrived and levees were built that now hold back water from land that was never supposed to be below the river. In some places, the void forming below the surface has been growing for years, for decades possibly, without a single visible surface expression, the ceiling thinning at a rate measurable only by instruments that most homeowners have no access to and no reason to know about, waiting for the threshold where the load above finally exceeds the strength that remains below. The satellite sees all of it, every millimeter of annual descent, every month's worth of incremental compaction, every zone of active dissolution in every mapped karst county. In every location across the country where the ground is in motion, down incrementally, consistently, and in most cases for reasons that are entirely understood and in some cases entirely preventable. The maps are drawn. They have been drawn for years. They are more precise today than they were last year, and they will be more precise next year than they are today. The monitoring system is not the limitation. The science is not the limitation. The gap between the millimeter precision of the satellite image and the coarseness of the institutional response to what that image shows, that is where the problem lives. What the car disappearing into a Pinellas County driveway and the San Joaquin Valley floor sitting 28 feet below where it started, and the New Orleans pump system running ceaselessly against a city that is sinking toward the water that wants to reclaim it. What all of these share is not geological coincidence. They are expressions of the same pattern, ground that was holding up something built on it, slowly losing the capacity to hold. The process is different in each place. The physics is different, the time scale is different, the consequence is the same. The question was never whether the maps were right. The maps have been right for decades. The ground is still dissolving. The maps already know where.